Well, good morning, everyone, and apologies for the brief delay there. A few small technical issues that we've now resolved. I'm hoping you can all hear me. Please let me know if not, and we'll get things started fairly quickly. For those of you that haven't used this platform before, there is a chat option on the right-hand side with a little hand speak request, I think it's called. If you wanted to message or ask questions on the way through, please feel free to do that as we go through the process. Let's get started today. We've got a succession masterclass in one of several in our series, and we're going to actually walk through now the topic of family business succession and talking about the succession issues that are particular and peculiar, if you like, for small to medium family-owned businesses, and they are often quite different to other business ownership type structures. So let's have a look at some of the key issues that might arise as we go through this particular area. Firstly, a bit of a review of where we've been and where we're headed. We've done 5 of these webinars. No, we haven't. We've done 4. This is the 5th one today. Webinars so far, covered off on some background market research and psychology, looked at valuation, some structuring and asset protection, and then last month we looked at the small business CGT concessions. Today, as I said, we're going to look specifically at family business and how in particular family business is different and a little bit peculiar and a little bit unusual, and a few things that we really need to focus on when we're dealing with family businesses because they are quite different. So a little bit of background on myself. Obviously an accountant by background, have been focused on succession and exit planning since 2009 through Succession Plus, and seeing a lot of increased activity in this particular space. A lot of business owners now approaching retirement, baby boomers typically, but not always, and starting to think about and worry about their succession and exit planning. 2 business partners in Succession Plus, both Queenslanders, Scott Patterson and Don Poole, again, both from an accounting background and both with some expertise in dealing with small to medium business owners over a period of time. We also got an accredited advisor program that I'll tell you about briefly. We've got 26 accredited advisors throughout the country, and we're still recruiting more, actively looking to fill up some gaps, geographically gaps when I say that, in country towns and regional areas where we don't have enough advice. And interestingly enough, in Victoria, we're fairly light on as well, given the number of client inquiries, etc. we're getting there. We're a little bit light on in terms of the number of advisors. If you're interested in that, please reach out and contact me. We won't cover that off in any more detail than that today, but certainly still recruiting actively. If you're looking to be involved, happy to hear from you. Where does this fit into the overall business succession exit planning model? As some of you know, we've developed a 21-step process that covers off on succession and exit planning. The family business model actually covers nearly all of these steps because it's a little bit unusual. It's a little bit different in that it covers some of them slightly differently to what we do with a larger business that's got, for example, 20 unrelated shareholders, corporate sort of style structure. But family business covers off. We run each of our clients through this 21-step process. We've been using it for quite some time. It works really well. We fine-tuned it over the years. When I first started doing this in 2009, it was actually a 9-step process. Then we went to 11 and now 21. And 21's been where it's at for about 5 or 6 years now. We've obviously added a whole stack of tools and templates into each one of those steps to make this work even better for business owners. So let's have a look at some background on Australian family businesses. Timely that we're having this discussion this month. Just recently, in fact, only in the last couple of weeks, the new KPMG Family Business Australia survey was released, and we've got lots of new data to share with you. So still a predominance of family-owned businesses in Australia, and of course throughout the world. There's many, many family businesses. Most of you in your daily life would deal with a family-owned business, whether it's the local restaurant or bakery or hairdresser. A lot of those retail businesses are still family-owned. What most people don't understand, though, is there are quite a number of very large, substantial family businesses, not just the big names that we hear about all the time, like Bing Lee, for example, and some of those well-known family businesses. There are lots and lots of other businesses that are owned by families. I was in Queensland the last few days and met a couple of family-owned businesses up there where the businesses even already passed on from mum and dad to the 2 brothers or the 2 sisters underneath, and they're now running that business and sort of working out how they go. Very, very common. The interesting thing that's happened in the last 20 years is that we're not typically seeing the old-fashioned family business with mum and dad, and maybe the son or daughter works in the business. Now we're seeing combinations of family and friends and step families and adopted families and the in-laws working together, and that makes things a little bit more interesting, a little bit more complicated when we're dealing with that complexity in structure of ownership, etc. The key thing, as always, and I think this is not necessarily just true of family businesses, but it's certainly very important for family businesses to get right, and that is communication. Obviously, the communication is critical here. There's a level of complication around that communication because often what happens in family businesses, particularly where you've got family members that are literally living together, you know, mum and dad, or, you know, mum and dad and the older son, for example, is running the business and they all live together. The communication is often confused between the family, the business, work, personal, you know, personal relationships, etc. It all gets very clouded. And so the communication can often be quite emotionally heated, not because of the business, but because of the family and personal relationships that sit around it. And so we do have to consider that. And we'll actually look later at some structures that we put in place to help facilitate and manage that communication to make it a little bit more easy to manage in terms of business versus personal. We'll talk about that a little bit later. One of the things that came out of the KPMG and Family Business Australia report, it's literally come out in the last key factor. One of the things that it show emotional wealth, SEW, they call it, a measure of the non-financial or emotional value for the family. So yes, there's a lot of family businesses that derive a lot of financial benefit for the family, and many families are now quite wealthy off the back of owning and running a family business for many years. But there's also this socio-emotional wealth, non-financial wealth for the family. And that can be as simple as things like providing a mechanism and a succession path for younger generations to come through and work in the family business. In some cases, it might be the security and the knowledge. And even in the case of the business that I met this week in Queensland, there's a bit of prestige and, you know, well known in the area, well regarded because they've been successful in business. That's not really just financial, it's also an emotional sort of metric as well. That has some complexity attached to it, obviously, when we go down that road that we need to think about and keep in mind when we're dealing with businesses. According to the survey, social and emotional wealth is made up of family and influence, identification with the business. And you might remember way back when we talked about the psychology of succession, which I think was back in February, I mentioned this thing called role identity fusion. And that second point here is talking about that, where the business owner or owners are particularly identified with the business. And you'll see some of them still call the business under their own name. Some of them still have the family name on the front door. And definitely they're very much identified with the business itself. And in fact, the idea of role identity fusion is the inability to separate the business from the individual. And that creates significant problems for succession. Binding social ties, obviously there's a whole community there. If you own a business, you've got a community of employees, you've got a community of suppliers, you've got a community of customers, other businesses in the same area or location or shopping centre or wherever you might be. There's a whole sort of social network around the ownership of the business that's outside of your normal external social network. Emotional attachment. Many family business owners we speak to are emotionally attached to their business. In fact, I was speaking to someone, as I said, in Queensland yesterday, taken over the business from mum and dad, and they're now thinking about whether they should exit and how they should do that. And they're actually quite emotional about it. They were close to tears just talking about the fact that they were even thinking about selling the business. Imagine the day when they do sell and they have to move out and hand it over to someone else. They're very emotionally attached. There's a lot of blood, sweat and tears gone into these businesses over many years in some cases. And so that does create a very strong emotional attachment. And the last one, renewal of family bonds through dynastic succession. And we're going to talk about this in a little bit. There's two sides to this, and one is obviously a very positive, you know, handing on the business to your children or to their children even. You know, I've got some examples where we're dealing with the third generation now in businesses, and they're quite powerful emotional and family connections where that business has really been a family business built up through the family and handed on generation after generation. The other side of that, of course, is the reverse, where there is an expectation that the children are going to take on the family business, but for whatever reason that doesn't happen. There's a blockage there, or there's a break, or there's a barrier to. It might be as simple as the children that we're interested in handing the business over to don't want to take it on because they're interested in doing something completely different with their career or their life, or living somewhere well away from the family business, etc. And that does create a massive barrier or issue. And that's the other side of the renewal of family bonds through succession. So a couple of things that impact SEW, future growth and performance. And that's obviously, we're starting to think there about things like disruption, digital disruption, and other forms of disruption, where the business that was so successful for such a long period of time may not be, because there's a change in the economy, or some disruption has come into place, or a competitor has moved in. And therefore, the future growth and performance of the business may not be as stable and as consistent as what it had been perhaps in the past. The transition strategies, we're seeing lots of different strategies now. The days of mum and dad turning 65 and passing the business on to the children on that day, literally, is very, very rarely the case now. We're seeing parents working much longer. We're seeing children delaying into the business. Perhaps they're going off and doing some study or working somewhere else in the meantime. And so the transition strategies are now quite different. We're also seeing, as you know, we do a lot of work in the employee share plan space. We're seeing sometimes these transition strategies now where the family needs to employ an external CEO who's not a family member. Quite confronting for most families to go down that road. But what we're now seeing is, they're using things like employee share plans and equity incentive plans to lock in those people who aren't family members, because unlike the family, they don't have the family investment in the business. Confidence and commitment, how confident is the next generation about taking over? How committed are they to working? We've met numbers of generational change children, particularly, who are looking at mum and dad and saying, I don't want to work 90 hours a week like you have been. It's just not for me. I don't want to work 7 days a week. I don't want to work till 7 o'clock at night and then come home and do the books, etc. And so there's a commitment question around it. There's also some confidence issues around, will the business be as profitable and as well performing in the future as it has been in the past? The simplest example of that is some retailers where you see digital disruption coming in, online trading, Amazon, even in the older days, eBay coming in and sort of disrupting that flow where people used to go into a retail store to buy clothing or shoes or whatever it was. That's no longer necessarily the case. And the last one, governance for the future. We're starting to see a trend towards improved corporate governance inside family businesses. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that later, just to show you exactly the sort of things that we're talking about there, because that is now something that can add some confidence and manage the growth and performance going forward. Sources of conflict. Obviously, this is a fairly key issue, and there's a lot here. I'm not going to read through all of these, but there's a theme here. You can see some of the key things, and these are not necessarily all related to family business, but some of them will be. Things like sibling rivalry and competence of family members, remuneration of family members. Does everyone in the family automatically get paid the same amount, or should they get paid according to the work that they're doing and the seniority that they hold within the business, etc.? So there's some balancing issues there. Obviously, succession is always a source of potential conflict where we've got to make decisions about who and how and when, and we'll talk more about that. So the first thing to understand about succession, particularly in a family business, is that it's not an event but a process. It's not normally a day where you just turn up and sign some paperwork and the business is now transferred from mum and dad to the son or the daughter or both. That's not the case. It's generally a process, and it can take quite some time as the business and the ownership structures evolve with the two key about management succession we talk about. That is, who is managing and controlling and running the business day to day? How's it operating? Who has to control, who makes decisions, etc. And the second one is who owns the business. And typically, this was always linked. These two things have pretty much always been linked in family business. The owner was also the manager, the CEO, the managing director, the controller, the person that paid the bills, etc. That no longer is always the case, and we're starting to see now people getting clear, separating this idea of income, equity, and control. And obviously the two things here are talking about management as in control and ownership as in equity, and starting to see that we can separate those. The owners don't necessarily have to manage the business. We may well employ external managers, and family members may not want to be the CEO or MD. I've got a great client here where the son is actually a fantastic architect, but he doesn't want to run the business. He wants to be an architect. And so it's a family business, been around for some time. They're passing it on to the son, and he will actually be a majority owner of that business, but we're going to put some key management in place around him because he simply doesn't want to do that. He wants to be an architect, not a business manager or CEO. So we're going to employ an external CEO. Very important to understand the distinction and the ability to separate those two items because it can make quite a difference. Just some basic statistics before we get into some of the tools that we use. You can see some of this stuff hasn't changed for some time. The Family Business Australia report comes out every year. It's really quite interesting and useful information, but you can see, there's a big gap here. There's a lot of people that don't have a succession strategy, haven't documented anything, haven't put things in place or even thought about what that strategy needs to look like. 60% still planning to pass on leadership to a family member. The statistics tell us that doesn't happen 60% of the time. It just doesn't happen. You can obviously plan to pass on leadership to a family member. If they don't want to accept it or take it on, then that creates a different barrier. Time-wise, in terms of timing, there's still a large number of these businesses looking to transition in the next 5 years. Some of them are looking to delay longer than that, but if you take those first two numbers together, what have we got there? 72% looking to pass on the business in the next 4 years. So a large number of these businesses looking to transact. And as I've said before, this baby boomer generation passing on businesses, it's the largest transfer of wealth in the history of the earth. So it's substantial and there's a lot of it happening. Now, in terms of ownership succession, this is a little bit different. Still about a third, that number hasn't changed in 10 years. About a third of business owners have absolutely no ownership succession plan. They don't think about it. They haven't done anything about it. You'll see some of the options here. 24% intending to sell or close the business. That's quite an emotional decision for most family members. 63% intending to pass it on to family members. And obviously they've got to be willing to accept it again. Again, all looking to happen in the next short time frame, although you'll notice that the management transfer is many, many more businesses, 72% looking to transfer in the next 4 years, whereas only 40% are looking to transfer ownership. Now, obviously those two numbers can only work if we separate ownership succession from management succession. We can't transition them both at the same time if those statistics are right. Just having a look at some of the detail around where they're headed and some of the planning of firms intending to pass on within the next 5 years, what have they done in terms of preparation? Is there a documented plan? And you'll see the vast majority there's not. Process for appointing a new CEO or MD, how many have actually done any planning there? How many have got a plan under development and how many have actually documented it is the grey sort of barrier there. And you'll see there's big gaps here, large gaps in the planning space. Planning for ownership succession is even worse. You generally find there's about a quarter of all businesses have done absolutely nothing. The 42 or 47%, depending on which chart you're looking at, I find that's fairly high, and that's probably, they say that they've got a plan under development, and often that means they've thought about it, but there's actually no documented plan and nothing really done about that. Here's the key. One of the key things is sort of a number of this second generation or even third generation in some examples really concerned about the future and what's it going to look like and how do I prepare for what I need to do as part of that. Now, a couple of triggers, and, interestingly, I'm going to jump to the end here, begin with the end in mind. The most common advice from survey respondents was to start earlier, and yet we're seeing people not doing that. People are waiting, and these are the triggers they typically wait for. I've got some really interesting triggers. I've had family business owners come to me with triggers like my next door neighbour had a heart attack is a common one. It's one I've heard a number of times actually, or my friend or my brother or my, somebody at work has had a heart attack and therefore I need to get this happening. The other one that we've got, I've had one family who waited until their daughter got married and moved out of home to then do the succession plan for the family business. Others are more, sometimes it's a case of illness or dispute or divorce or some sort of trigger event, but often it's these three things here. Firstly, getting some professional advice recommending succession. That might be their accountant or lawyer saying to them, you really need to think about succession. The second one, the current generation just being ready to transition. The people I was talking about before that I met in Queensland this week, one of the things they said to me was, we're just tired. we've really had enough. We've done enough. We've been doing this for 20 odd years and we're tired and we want to do something different. So just being ready to transition. And the other side is the incoming generation being ready to take over. And there's often an imbalance here where people wait too long to pass it on and the younger generation really gives up and stops waiting. Again, most common advice, start early. So if you've got clients and you're an advisor and you're talking to clients, you cannot start this too early. I've never had any feedback from anyone, and there won't be anyone in this survey whose advice or response was, leave it till later. The advice is always start earlier, start as early as you possibly can. A couple of key principal outcomes. It's interesting just to have a look at what some of the key things that business owners are looking for in terms of outcomes. Obviously, continuity of the business, and this is common whether it's family business or not. You will nearly always see business owners are very keen for the business to continue after they go. In fact, I spoke to some people a couple of weeks ago in Perth. One of the owners asked me, is it possible in the sale contract to include the fact that they can't change the name of the business? And that's just a demonstration of the emotional attachment and the connection with the business. And you can see, interestingly on this chart, there's 6 principal outcomes from family business owners. The last one, the lowest ranking one with only 30%, is selling the business for the best price. Continuity, family harmony, ongoing employment for employees, keeping the business in the family, leaving a legacy, all rate higher than selling the business for the best price. And so that's a fairly important thing to understand and remember as part of advising family business owners, etc. Barriers. What are the things that block succession and these transactions happening successfully? Again, from an advice point of view, really useful to remember. Ensuring the fair distribution of assets among family members. That's becoming more difficult. As there's imbalances in asset value, baby boomers have enjoyed a fantastic boom. No coincidence that the word's the same, in wealth creation, in value of properties, in value of their businesses and their assets, in value of their share market portfolios and everything else. But to manage that and make sure that they're fairly distributed amongst, for example, 3 children, how do you do that? We've got a client at the moment we're working with whose son has been the general manager and worked in the business since he left school. Daughter has never worked in that business. She's got her own successful career as a lawyer. And the family are now working out, well, if they give the business to the son and the property portfolio to the daughter, they're not fairly balanced. The valuations are vastly different. And so how do we equate that? How do we adjust that, if you like? The capacity of the business to provide adequate returns, that's often a generational issue. Certainly provided an adequate return for mum and dad, but we've got 4 children. It can't provide an adequate return for 4 families. It can provide for 1, maybe 2, but not 4. So that's a bit of an issue. And then how do we fund mum and dad's retirement? Generally, there's economic uncertainty about where we at, boom, busts, where we at with GFC happened a few years ago, vastly changed the retirement and succession plans for large family businesses. And then how do we support the next generation? There's a theme here. All those things are financial. So even though that when we looked at the principal outcomes, the financial was the last one, financial in terms of barriers is often a problem. How do we manage these dynamics, family dynamics, meaning that succession is not retirement, that we've still got businesses that have passed on from mum and dad to the children, but mum and dad are still working in the business or still being actively involved. Priorities and advisors in our role. Obviously, the dynamics around advice is really important for family businesses. Good advisors that work in this space are trusted by the family. They're known by many family members. They rely on their advice. They listen to it. They take notice of it. And so obviously there's a key driving role there from an advice point of view. How do we go about it? Again, as I said, we use a 21-step process. We walk through these stages and make sure that people understand each step. Family business doesn't change the process, but it changes the focus of the process around the outcomes that we're trying to deliver for clients. Still trying to improve value, though, as I said in that slide before, that's not always the primary outcome. It is, generally speaking, though, 2 key things come out of this. One is, yes, how do we increase the value if we're going to pass it on to our children? Secondly, how do I make sure it's successful after the transition? And often we're being asked to work with the next generation post-succession event occurring to manage the ongoing management and, operation of the business to ensure that it's still successful and to leave that legacy and to look after employees, etc. That still becomes a large priority. as much, at least, as important, if not more important, than the increase in valuation that we're seeing on this particular slide here. Some really interesting quotes here from very successful family businesses. I don't like the word dynasty, but that's exactly what it is. It's not just a business. There's a lot going on in the background. Family businesses often talk about this, that there's a lot of pressure from parents passing the business onto their children not to muck it up, to keep it going, to keep it being successful, to preserve the brand and the image and the name and the quality and so on. I just want to briefly pause. We've had a look at this model before, but from a family business point of view, this model is really important. This is research data that's now actually fairly old. It's 20 or 30 years old now, but it just maps out for you what's called the three-circle model of family business. And it really looks at, you can be an owner, you can be in the business, an employee, for example, and you can be a family member. And the issue is really where these circles all intersect. Often we get the circle intersection there at 3, 4, 6, and 7, where people are playing more than one role. So if you're just an owner, that's okay. If you're just an employee, that's okay. If you're just a family member, that's okay. Where we've got these overlaps. So for example, number 4 means that you're an owner, you're not an employee, but you're obviously a family member. And heaven help you if you sit in number 7, because you're an owner, shareholder, you're an employee, so you work in the business, and you're also a family member. Understanding the dynamics between these 3 circles, and particularly the areas where they overlap, is actually a really useful tool. I've used this tool a number of times to talk to family business owners about what's going on in business, what's going on in the family, how does that intersect with the ownership structures, etc. And I'll show you some of the things that we do around managing that going forward. Certainly there's some communication models and structures, and this is how we manage that communication process. So firstly, showing them the 3-circle model and having a conversation with them about what it means to be in those 3 circles and to be in more than one circle and how they overlap is really an important first step. Then what we do is set some communication structures at each of those levels. We've got an ownership structure, which is a shareholders meeting. It should be different to the business communication structure because that's about management. That's corporate governance. It's a board of directors. It's a management meeting, etc. And just because you're a shareholder doesn't mean you attend the management meetings on a Monday morning. Or just because you're a shareholder doesn't mean you're necessarily a director. And in fact, with asset protection and some of the recent changes in that space, we're getting a lot of advisors saying to people, well, it's okay to transition the business, but you don't want mum and dad to continue on as directors because then they've got all these liability issues post-retirement. And lastly, if you're a family member, that certainly doesn't give you the right, and this is the most challenging one, being a family member doesn't necessarily give you the right to be on the board of directors or to come to the management meetings or to get involved. What we put in place there is a family council. And that family council is a little bit similar to a board of directors or shareholders, but it's more focused on what does the family specifically want out of the business. Is it about financial reward? Is it about employment for future generations? Is it about preserving a legacy, etc.? And so the family can give some direction to the board about what they're actually trying to achieve through running the business. That mechanism and managing those 3 meetings, I've actually had several examples where with clients we've actually managed those 3 separate meetings with 3 separate groups of people. Occasionally there'll be overlap based on the 3-circle model, but often there's 3 different groups of people, and it's about keeping the agenda and the discussion within those meetings focused on what it is we should be doing as a family council or a shareholder group rather than the board of directors or management. This is a really interesting one, talking about the family council. I love this quote. The only rock I know that stays steady, the only institution I know that works is the family. And that's generally saying that when we come back to that model of communication model and structure, the family council should be running what's going on. They should be determining overall for what purpose. They should be answering the why question. Why have we got this business? What are we trying to do with it? It's up to then the shareholders and the board of directors to actually work out how we deliver on that. This is an interesting one as well. This was from a family business magazine a few years ago. As it says here, and this is what the family council's about. It's actually getting 100 voices to share with one voice, to get together all everybody's different ideas and expectations about the business. And you'll often get those different expectations in that meeting where you'll get, you know, the son says, well, I want employment for my 3 children. His brother says, well, I don't want that. I want a dividend paid every quarter. I don't care who works there. They need to be the best employee, not necessarily family members. So you get this conflicting view of expectations and what the idea of the business is, and the family council communication is important in coordinating that into one voice. So a summary view. Family business is very similar to all the others. We still use our 21-step process. They still need to prepare for exit, etc. But there's a couple of key things that really stand out with family business. There's key risks that reduce valuation. That is nearly always key person dependence. In a family, that's normally heavily exaggerated. When you've got an external business owned by several different people that are unrelated, you'll get an external CEO, professional manager, if you like. When it's all in the family, then it becomes very family dependent. You'll find the family is very secretive and they run a very closed shop operation. The family talks about what's going in the business, but they don't often share that with the key management team, etc. That obviously reduces the valuation because it adds a substantial level of key person risk. So it's really quite important when we go down the road of a sale process, if we're actually externally selling, managing those stakeholders, as in the family members that are in that three-circle model but may well not be owners, may well not be employees. That becomes quite a process. Number one issue, and I want to come back to this because this is really important, number one issue for Australian family business succession is funding. It always has been and it always will be. It is becoming more and more difficult now. You've all seen the changes in funding for small business over the last few years. It started initially with the GFC. Things got a lot tighter and a lot more difficult to borrow money, as opposed to, you know, the early 2000s where banks were literally throwing money around at anyone that would sign documents. And in some cases, based on the Royal Commission, anyone who wouldn't sign documents. But now it's become more difficult with GFC and even more difficult recently. There's a lot of press coverage now. You'll see we've been doing a little bit of work with Kate Carnell, the Australian Small Business and Family Business Ombudsman, and seeing there's a lot of information coming out of her office around funding options for small business because it's a very significant problem. And the family business model, where it used to be, you know, you'd secure mum and dad's house as the mortgage that the bank took to allow the business to have an overdraft. Well, sometimes those businesses have grown way past that capability, and as mum and dad look to retire, we don't really want to tie their house up with security over the business, etc., etc. The funding is a big issue, and it's really something that we need to get right. I'll leave this quote with you. I think this is fantastic, and I love the way that it finishes because it talks about the biggest challenge in family businesses is the patriarch who lingers too long. We talked before about emotional involvement. Succession is the most emotional issue of all, and it's really difficult to manage. But obviously, you know, starting early, using the three-circle model, embedding those systems of communication. Often family communication is very much informal. You know, you'll often have a family dinner for someone's birthday and they talk about the business during the dinner. Whilst that's fine and it worked in the olden days and it's a bit old-fashioned now, you certainly need to formalise those communication structures into that family council, into that owners or shareholders group, etc. Because otherwise it does become this very, very difficult emotional process. As I said, key things, keep in mind the 21-step process, still to be used as part of a succession plan. We don't change the process, but we do change the focus. As I said before, we're still looking to recruit good accredited advisors, a stack needed in certainly in Victoria, including Melbourne. Most of the other capital cities around the country we've now got well and truly covered, but we're certainly looking to recruit people in Melbourne and wider Victoria. And if you're interested in that, please just yell out and touch base with me. We're basically halfway through the accredited advisor or the advisor masterclass series. There are 5 to go. This is the 5th one today. There are 5 to go. July, we're going to look at maximising value and really focus on that from a buyer's point of view. What are buyers really looking for? In August, we're going to look at employee share plans as a succession option. In September, we're going to look at strategic sales, and that's not so much what a buyer's worried about, but what are they really attracted to? Why are they paying premiums for some businesses? What is it that makes that happen? October, the M&A process, some tips and traps around actually selling businesses and some of the things you do. And then in November, we're going to put together an action plan around how to actually help your clients and attract new clients to the business as well through offering services around succession and exit planning. So I'm going to open up to questions. If people have questions, obviously you've got the chat box on your screen. Please type the question in there. I'm happy to answer them as we go through. And we can hopefully answer some of those questions now. If there are some questions, I've got a couple popping up now, people typing in, I can see. I'm happy to answer them now. I'm also happy to answer questions subsequently after the session if people have questions that come back to you a bit later on. Okay, first one, the likelihood of success in family business. Okay, so the likelihood of a successful succession in family business has decreased, as in our experience, the younger generation is not interested in continuing on. That's certainly true of quite a number of our clients that we see have come to us with that exact problem. I've got a great business that's made really good money over time. My children don't want to take it on, or my son doesn't want to take it on, or my daughter's not interested in it. She wants to study law, etc. That's certainly an issue. It's not an issue with every business. There are lots of businesses where family succession is actually working quite well, and that will be the exit option for that particular family. But in a lot of cases, yes, that is quite true, and we're seeing that. Two things that we do there. One is it's about having a conversation with the children and their parents in the same room and facilitating that conversation about why. What is it that you don't want to take on? And often you'll find it's something that's either a misunderstanding around what's expected, or it might well be simply, I've had a number of examples where the children simply say, I don't want to work the number of hours mum and dad have worked. And of course, that may well be because the business was started 20 years ago, and it's hard work when you do a startup 20 years ago to build it up to what it is today. But now it's a larger business. It's got some scale. It's been quite profitable. It's built up. Maybe they're often about communicating that. The other thing is it's often about the fact that the children are interested in working in or on the business, but they don't necessarily want to be the CEO. And so we've had some success in bringing in external managers, CEOs, etc., and incentivizing them through some sort of employee share plan, etc., to manage, exactly how that actually works, and whether we can try and match somehow the equity incentive that the family has into those key managers by using an incentive plan, sometimes a share plan, although often families do want to keep the equity in their own hand, and so sometimes it's a profit share plan or some sort of bonus scheme structured around performance. Other question we've got here from Michael talking about capital gains tax within family businesses. Can you go through the different treatment that might apply? In short, unfortunately, Michael, probably not, because that could take quite some time. But what I can say is, obviously there are some benefits to having business structured in the family where perhaps it's inside a family trust and you don't have to necessarily sell it to the children to transition it. But that's definitely a topic for another day. Michael, I'm happy to have a conversation with you separately about that if you wanted to, but I don't really think we've got enough time to cover off on that right now. Certainly there's some things you can do, but that's a fairly complicated area and fairly specific advice, depending on individual circumstances. Okay, the last one, how do I get a copy of the 3-circle model? Yep, so this webinar, that's a good question. So how do I get a copy of the 3-circle model you talked about? The 3-circle model is available as part of this recording. So all of our webinars are recorded and they're all available on our website. So if you either missed one of the webinars earlier in the series or you just wanted to go back on today's one and get some more information, they're all recorded. If you give us a couple of days, the recording gets processed and updated, etc., edited, and then posted up on our website. So if you have a look sort of early next week, you'll be able to find this webinar on our website. There's a thing called a resource hub or a content hub, and you can go and find the webinar recording in there, and certainly you'll be able to find the 3-circle model. I would be very surprised if you simply went to Google and typed in family business 3-circle model. You'd probably find 3 or 4 different versions of it as well. So I hope that's been helpful. Our contact details are on the screen. Please feel free to send through questions or follow-up information if you wanted to. Happy to talk to you further, and I hope you can join us on the 12th of July when we look at what a buyer's worried about in terms of maximising value of businesses then. Thanks for joining us on the Advisor Masterclass series. I look forward to talking to you again next month.